I never thought I'd be sitting in a defendant's chair, staring at DNA evidence that supposedly proved I was a killer. But that's exactly where I found myself 6 months ago, and what I discovered about the judge presiding over my case still haunts me today. My name is Trevor, and this is the story of how I uncovered the most shocking conspiracy in my city's legal history. It all started when my neighbor, Catherine Walsh, was found dead in her apartment. Catherine was 62, lived alone, and kept to herself mostly. We'd exchange pleasantries when we crossed paths in the hallway, but that was about it. So when Detective Morrison knocked on my door that Tuesday morning, I assumed they were just asking routine questions. "We're investigating Catherine Walsh's death," Morrison said, notepad in hand. "When did you last see her?" "Maybe 3 days ago," I replied. "We passed each other by the mailboxes. She seemed fine." The questions were standard at first. Where was I? Sunday night. Did I know Catherine well? Had I ever been in her apartment? I answered everything honestly. No, I'd never been inside her place. Yes, I was home Sunday watching Netflix. No, I didn't really know her personally. 2 weeks later, Morrison was back. This time, he wasn't asking questions. "Trevor Matthews, you're under arrest for the murder of Catherine Walsh." My world collapsed in that moment. As they cuffed me, Morrison explained that they'd found my DNA at the crime scene, not just trace amounts, significant DNA evidence that placed me in Catherine's apartment around the time of her death. "That's impossible," I kept saying. "I was never in her apartment. Never. But DNA doesn't lie, right?" That's what everyone kept telling me. My court-appointed attorney, Linda Foster, reviewed the evidence file with grim efficiency. The DNA was found on Catherine's kitchen counter, on her bedroom doorknob, and on a glass in her sink. The prosecution's theory was that I'd entered her apartment to rob her. She'd surprised me, and I'd strangled her in the struggle. "The evidence is overwhelming," Linda said during our first meeting. "The district attorney is seeking life without parole." Judge Harrison Caldwell was assigned to my case. Caldwell had a reputation as a fair but stern judge, someone who'd been on the bench for over 20 years. When I first saw him during arraignment, he looked exactly like what you'd expect from a judge, distinguished, authoritative, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through you. "Mr. Matthews," he said during that first hearing, "you understand the severity of the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor, but I'm innocent." He nodded slightly, but I could see in his expression that he'd heard that from every defendant who'd ever stood before him. The weeks leading up to trial were torture. I couldn't afford my own attorney, so I was stuck with Linda, who seemed overwhelmed by her caseload. She filed the standard motions, but there wasn't much to work with. The DNA evidence was solid, processed by the state lab using standard protocols. During pretrial hearings, Judge Caldwell was professional but cold. He denied most of our motions, ruled against us on evidence suppression, and generally seemed to be paving the way for a quick conviction. Linda said that was normal. Judges don't like to appear soft on murder cases. But there was something that bothered me. During one hearing, when Linda was arguing about the chain of custody for the DNA evidence, I noticed Judge Caldwell's reaction. For just a moment, when the lab technician was explaining how the samples were processed, the judge looked nervous. It was subtle, but I'd spent my entire adult life reading people's expressions in my job as an insurance investigator, and something about his reaction felt off. That night in my cell, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would a judge be nervous about routine DNA testimony? The trial began on a Monday. The prosecution's opening statement painted me as a desperate man who'd targeted an elderly neighbor for robbery. They presented the DNA evidence methodically, calling the lab technician, the crime scene investigator, and Detective Morrison to establish their case. Judge Caldwell presided with his usual stern demeanor, but I kept watching him during the DNA testimony. Again, I saw that flicker of something. Anxiety? Fear? I couldn't quite place it. On the third day of trial, something unexpected happened. During a recess, I overheard Judge Caldwell talking to his bailiff in hushed tones near the side exit. "Make sure those lab files stay sealed," he said quietly. "We don't need any complications." The bailiff nodded and walked away, but I'd heard enough to know something wasn't right. Why would a judge be concerned about lab files staying sealed? Wasn't transparency supposed to be part of the process? That evening, I managed to call my old colleague from the insurance company, Pete Hendricks. Pete had connections throughout the city, including some people who worked in law enforcement. "Pete, I need a favor," I said during our brief call. Can you find out anything about Judge Caldwell? Anything at all that might be unusual? Pete was skeptical, but agreed to look into it. 2 days later, he called back with information that changed everything. Trevor, this is going to sound crazy, but Judge Caldwell has been acting strange lately. My contact at the courthouse says he's been staying late, accessing files he shouldn't normally need, and asking unusual questions about evidence storage. What kind of questions? About the DNA lab specifically. How evidence is stored, who has access, stuff like that. And here's the weird part. 3 months ago, there was a break-in at the DNA lab. Nothing was reported stolen, but some files were accessed. My heart started racing. When exactly was this break-in? Let me check. It was 2 weeks before Catherine Walsh was killed. The pieces were starting to come together, but I needed more proof. During the next court session, I watched Judge Caldwell even more carefully. When the lab technician testified about the specific samples found in Catherine's apartment, the judge's hands trembled slightly as he took notes. I also noticed something else. Throughout the trial, whenever DNA evidence was discussed, Judge Caldwell would touch his left wrist, almost like a nervous habit. It was subtle, but consistent. On Thursday night, Pete called again with more disturbing news. Trevor, I did some digging into Judge Caldwell's background. 23 years ago, before he was a judge, there was an incident. A woman named Susan Martinez was found dead in her apartment. Caldwell was a prosecutor then, and he was questioned as a person of interest because he'd been seen arguing with her at a bar the night before. What happened with that case? It went cold. No arrests were ever made. But here's the thing. Susan Martinez was strangled, just like Catherine Walsh. The pattern was becoming clear, but I still needed concrete proof. The next day in court, I made a decision that could have destroyed any remaining chance I had. During a brief moment when the prosecution was conferring, I stood up. Your Honor, I have something to say. Linda grabbed my arm, trying to pull me back down, but I continued. I believe there's been a serious error in the DNA evidence, and I request that the court order an independent verification of the chain of custody. Judge Caldwell's face went pale. Mr. Matthews, your attorney should handle all motions. Your Honor, I'm representing myself in this matter. I formally request access to all DNA lab records, including security footage and access logs for the past 6 months. The prosecution objected immediately, but Judge Caldwell looked trapped. Denying such a reasonable request would look suspicious, but granting it might expose whatever he was hiding. I'll take this under advisement, he said, clearly flustered. During the lunch recess, Linda was furious with me, but I didn't care. I'd seen the fear in Caldwell's eyes, and I knew I was onto something. That afternoon, Pete called with the breakthrough I'd been hoping for. Trevor, my contact at the DNA lab, came through. She accessed the security footage from the night of the break-in. You're not going to believe this. What did she find? Judge Caldwell was there. He used some kind of override code to get into the lab after hours. The footage shows him accessing the evidence storage area. Can she get me a copy of that footage? She already did. She's sending it to your attorney right now. When Linda received the footage that evening, she was speechless. The security camera clearly showed Judge Caldwell entering the DNA lab, going directly to the evidence storage, and spending over an hour inside. The timestamp showed this happened 1 week before my arrest. This is insane, Linda whispered as we watched the footage. He planted your DNA at the crime scene. But how did he get my DNA in the first place? Linda rewound the footage and pointed to a small container in Caldwell's hand. He must have collected it somehow. Maybe from your previous court appearance, or... Then I remembered. 6 months earlier, I'd been called for jury duty. Judge Caldwell had presided over the jury selection process. During that day, we'd all been required to sign multiple documents and handle various paperwork. It would have been easy for him to collect DNA samples from pens, papers, or even the water glasses we'd used. He's been planning this for months, I realized. But we still needed to prove that Judge Caldwell was Catherine's real killer. The next morning, Linda filed an emergency motion to present new evidence. Judge Caldwell had no choice but to hear it, even though I could see the panic in his eyes. As Linda played the security footage in open court, the gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. The prosecution sat in stunned silence. Judge Caldwell gripped his gavel with white knuckles. Your Honor, Linda said, this footage clearly shows judicial misconduct and evidence tampering. We move for immediate dismissal of all charges. Judge Caldwell's voice shook as he spoke. This court will recess while I review this new evidence. But I wasn't done. I stood up again, knowing this might be my only chance. Your Honor, I have one more question. Where were you on the night Susan Martinez was killed 23 years ago? Judge Caldwell's face turned white as paper. That's irrelevant to this case. Is it? Because Susan Martinez was strangled just like Catherine Walsh, and both women had rejected your advances, hadn't they? The prosecution was objecting frantically, but I kept going. You killed Susan Martinez 23 years ago, but you got away with it. When Catherine Walsh threatened to report your inappropriate behavior at her apartment complex's board meetings, you decided to kill her too. But this time, you needed a scapegoat. So you planted my DNA and framed me for your crime. Judge Caldwell stood up abruptly, his judicial composure completely shattered. This court is adjourned indefinitely, he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. As he tried to leave the bench, Linda called out, Your Honor, you can't adjourn a trial without cause. But Caldwell was already fleeing toward his chambers. The bailiff, confused by the chaos, didn't stop him. That's when Detective Morrison, who'd been sitting in the gallery watching the proceedings, stood up and walked toward the bench. Harrison Caldwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Catherine Walsh and the murder of Susan Martinez. The judge stopped at his chamber door, his shoulders sagging in defeat. When he turned around, tears were streaming down his face. I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly. Catherine was going to destroy my reputation. She had photos of me, compromising photos from years ago. She was blackmailing me. The gallery was completely silent as Judge Caldwell confessed in his own courtroom. Susan was different. I was young, stupid. I thought she loved me, but she was going to leave town with another man. I couldn't let that happen. As the bailiff placed handcuffs on the man who'd been prepared to send me to prison for life, I felt a mixture of relief and disgust. This person, who was supposed to represent justice, had been willing to destroy my life to cover up his own crimes. The charges against me were dropped immediately. Judge Caldwell was eventually convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. The DNA lab protocols were completely overhauled, and several other cases where Caldwell had presided were reviewed for potential misconduct. Linda Foster became something of a local celebrity for uncovering the conspiracy, though she always credited me with pushing for the investigation that revealed the truth. As for me, I moved out of that apartment complex and tried to rebuild my life. But I learned something important through this nightmare. Sometimes the people you trust most, the ones wearing the robes and carrying the gavels, are the ones you should fear the most. The justice system worked in the end, but only because I refused to accept that DNA evidence was infallible. If I'd simply trusted the system and pleaded guilty, Judge Harrison Caldwell would still be on the bench today, and Catherine Walsh's real killer would have remained free. Sometimes justice isn't about the law. It's about refusing to give up when everyone tells you the evidence is against you. Because sometimes the evidence itself is the lie. And sometimes the person holding the gavel is the one who should be in chains. But at least now her real killer is where he belongs, and he'll never hurt anyone again. The system failed her, and it almost failed me. But in the end, the truth found a way to surface. It always does if you're willing to keep digging, even when everyone tells you to stop. That's my story. That's how I discovered that the judge presiding over my murder trial was actually the killer he was trying to convict me of being. And that's how I learned that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones wearing the robes of justice.